Chapter 3. Setting the Stage for Reform. The big question? Why did some people believe the church needed to be reformed during the 1400s and 1500s? Gutenberg's printing press did change the world, at least the European world. But before we talk about the changes that took place in Europe in the 1500s, let's journey further back in time. You may remember that after the fall of Rome in 476 CE, there was no longer a strong government to unite people in different countries. Instead, the Catholic Church took control. It soon became the largest and most powerful institution in Western Europe. The Church united people through a common belief in the Christian God and the Christian promise of heaven. The Church was very important to Europeans in the Middle Ages. It was the social glue that held communities together. It provided instruction on how to live in this world and how to get to the next world. The Church gave comfort and protection to those in need. The Church was also largely responsible for educating those fortunate enough to receive an education. If you had lived during this period in history, the Catholic Church would have been a major focus in your life. Typically, once a week, you would have gone to church to attend Mass. Mass is the central act of worship in the life of a Catholic. Depending on where you lived, the church you attended might have been an especially large and beautiful cathedral. Cathedrals were among the most impressive buildings in medieval Europe and would have been a constant reminder of the church's presence, power, and wealth. Most people, however, attended a much smaller local church. Latin and learning. Latin was the language of the church. The priest conducted Mass entirely in Latin. Songs sung in church by choirs, not the congregation, had Latin words. The Bible, too, was written in Latin. The problem was, only the church's clergy and the most educated people in society could speak, read, and understand Latin. For everyone else, Latin was a foreign language. Imagine going to church your entire life and never knowing exactly what was being said or sung. Since most people could not read or write, the local church was their main source of instruction with regard to church teachings. One of the most important teachings was that the church provided the only path to heaven. People who disobeyed or opposed church teachings risked punishment. If they persisted in doing something wrong, or in holding to beliefs that did not follow church doctrine and refused to recant, they could be accused of heresy. A person charged with heresy could be excommunicated. This meant that a person's membership in the Christian community was cut off, and so, people believed, was their access to heaven. In some cases, heresy was punishable by death. Growing power and influence. Throughout the Middle Ages, the power of the church continued to grow. Part of the reason behind this increasing power was money. Christians were not simply supposed to obey the church, but they were also expected to support it financially. Everyone was expected to give a portion of their yearly earnings to the church. The money, or goods such as crops and livestock, was paid like a tax and called a tithe. Over time, the church became very rich. It owned land, buildings, and even parts of towns. Wealthy people bequeathed land and money to the church. This wealth gave the Pope, who was the leader of the church, political as well as religious power. Questionable practices. For some time, the church had raised money by issuing certificates that could release or pardon people from penance. Penance was the punishment that the church taught was due after a sin was confessed and forgiven. Previously, penance had to be performed before a sin was forgiven. These certificates were called indulgences. Technically, indulgences weren't sold. They were given in exchange for donations of money. Nevertheless, the money raised by the issuing of indulgences became a huge business for the church. Many other corrupt practices also increased, such as the ability of wealthy people to buy their way into the clergy. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, religious reformers spoke out against corrupt practices in the church and demanded reform. The beginning. The word reform means to make changes to something in order to improve it. In European history, the Reformation, or the Protestant Reformation as it is also called, was a reform movement that challenged the Catholic Church. The movement challenged the Church's teachings and authority and demanded the reform of certain practices. The Reformation began as a religious debate, but quickly grew into something much larger. It laid the foundation for what would eventually become known as Protestantism, one of the three major branches of Christianity. The other branch of Christianity, the Orthodox Church, was formed hundreds of years earlier. Now, the Reformation would bring about Protestantism. In addition, the Reformation led to great political and social change throughout much of Europe. One reformer in particular helped usher in the Reformation. His name was Martin Luther. Luther was a German monk and a devout Catholic. Yet the corruption he saw in the church, along with his personal ideas about salvation, turned him against it. Luther's dispute with the church succeeded, at least in part, because of the printing press. Shifts in power. As a result of the Reformation, Europe experienced unrest, persecution, and several wars. However, Europe emerged from this period in history as a very different place. In some countries, religious reform was accompanied by political reform. A number of European monarchs challenged age-old traditions of power in relation to the church. They seized and then redistributed power, shifting it from the church and its leader, the Pope, to the state. This shift in power made monarchs more powerful. Over time, new forms of government were created in which more people had a voice. In time, the Catholic Church listened to the critics and began to reform itself from within. It became a more unified institution, despite having lost some of its political influence. To a large extent, much of Northern Europe and England became a stronghold of Protestantism. However, most other Western European states remained Catholic. As a result, European society was divided along religious lines in a way it had never been before. These divisions would continue to shape European history for many years to come. Against this backdrop, scientific advances were being made. Scientists such as Nicolaus Copernicus and Galileo Galilei made discoveries that led them to reject the long-held belief that Earth lay at the center of the universe. Instead, they proposed a new view of the solar system, with the Sun and not Earth at its center. Of princes and Protestants. When many people hear the word Protestant, they think about Martin Luther and other religious reformers of the Reformation. However, the word actually originated as a result of several German princes protesting a ruling by the Church that Luther be arrested and punished for his rebellious actions and ideas. These princes were the original Protestants. Over time, however, the term came to be associated with religious reformers like Luther, who protested against certain teachings and practices of the Church during the Reformation. And rebirth. As you know, the Renaissance was a cultural movement in Europe characterized by renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman civilization and learning. This revival of ancient ideas and ideals, the word Renaissance means rebirth, took hold during the latter part of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance sparked enormous creativity, and experimentation in European art, literature, architecture, music, and science. The Renaissance got its start in the Italian city of Florence. In time, however, the focus shifted from Florence to Rome, where the church had its papal offices, or headquarters. From about 1450 CE onward, one pope after another decided to support great Renaissance artists and architects, just like the wealthy residents of Florence did. The popes called artists to Rome and set them to work creating some of the most magnificent paintings, sculptures, and buildings of all time. The popes justified these artistic undertakings by claiming that when people saw majestic buildings, gorgeous paintings, and beautiful sculptures, they would be in awe. They would ponder the glory of God. They would also appreciate the splendor and power of the church and be thankful to be a part of it. But its power and role in people's lives was about to be seriously threatened.